In a recent video that I did on 1 Chronicles 23 through 27, I read a quote from Peter Leithart, and I remember saying it reminded me of Mary Douglas's proposal about the structure of Leviticus. I thought it would be a good video to do something on. This article is by Gary Rendsburg, and he has an academic version of this article. It's called like the two veils or the two screens or something like that. I know I have the article, but I don't know where it's at. But this article he wrote for the Torah.com, and I'll put a link to it. As far as I can tell, it's basically the same article. So we're not really missing out on using this internet article, but let's go ahead and just jump in. So the title is Leviticus as a Literary Tabernacle. And he writes, the late British anthropologist Mary Douglas proposed that Leviticus was designed to reflect the structure of the tabernacle, which in turn reflects the division of space during the revelation at Mount Sinai. In this reading, the two screens or curtains that divide the tabernacle are represented by Leviticus's only two narratives. Now that's still a little bit abstract, but as we proceed, you'll start seeing what his argument is. So here he has a picture of the inside of the tabernacle, and he's writing about how Leviticus 25, it's laying out these laws, so on and so forth, but the opening verse of Leviticus 25 is very odd. It reads, and Yahweh spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, saying, so on and so forth. Now, the most common opening to pericope in Leviticus is, and Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, and then it continues on. And this appears 27 times. Only at Leviticus 25 does the text add on Mount Sinai. Thus, the rabbi asked, what is the connection between sabbatical and Mount Sinai? This rabbinic dictum, which later came to mean why are two seemingly unrelated units juxtaposed, originates as a response to the odd introductory formula in Leviticus 25:1, which includes the geographical indicator on Mount Sinai. I thought this was funny, I didn't know this, but apparently that this is a kind of an idiom within rabbinic circles. What is the connection between sabbatical and Mount Sinai? Which means basically, why are these two seemingly unrelated texts put next to each other? Because it just seems odd. Why does it say that? And I'm going to skip through the traditional approaches just because they don't really concern us. And frankly, I don't think they answer the issue. So he moves down to Mary Douglas in her literary structural approach. So the British scholar Dame Mary Douglas, and she lived a long life. She passed away in 2007. She was the most important late 20th century social scientist to examine sections of the Bible from a serious anthropological vantage point. And if you've ever read anything about Leviticus, her book, Purity and Danger, will come up, or you'll have to interact with it at some point. Towards the end of her career, Douglas authored Leviticus as literature, with the ingenious proposal that the book of Leviticus evinces a literary structure that reflects the layout and configuration of the tabernacle. And so here's the tabernacle layout. It's a figure. The springboard of Douglas's reading was Sarna's insight, based on Rambam's discussion of the secrets of the tabernacle. That tabernacle is meant to function as an earthly Mount Sinai, and is even designed with the same tripartite division of space laid out in the pericope on Mount Sinai Revelation in Exodus 19 and 24. And so here you see it laid out next to each other. Outer court, all the Israelites, corresponds to the lower slope, all Israelites. Holy place, priests, halfway up the mountain, Mount Sinai. Aaron and the sons, the elders, holies of holies, or holy of holies, the priest, the high priest, and the summit, Moses, right? So these correspond to each other. And it's this insight that kind of led her down the path. We're going to pause briefly here for some art time because I want to draw this out. So this is not a mountain. This is a mountain. Right, so this is Mount Sinai, right? And here we'll quickly draw up a tabernacle. This obviously won't be proportioned very well, but we'll just do our best here. And let's make this a perfect square. Let's constrain proportions. Again, this isn't to scale, but hopefully you can see here. So this is what she was getting at. And we actually hit this in one of the Chronicles videos, that these correspond to each other, that basically the temple or tabernacle in this case is like a laying down Mount Sinai. And specifically, one of the interesting elements to this is, and this is really what it's getting at, is that there are these veils that block the entrance to the next section. And that, interestingly enough, is actually, it corresponds in Mount Sinai. We'll use this because there's not a cloud. So here we go. And so these are clouds, because if you read Exodus 19 and 24, you'll see mentions of clouds covering, and the clouds are essentially serving as the screens which cover the next section, right? So you have the laity at the summit, which corresponds to the outer court. Aaron and the priests, the elders, go higher up. This corresponds to the priests. And again, you have these sections being divided by a veil or by a cloud over here. And then at the summit of Mount Sinai, you have Moses, which corresponds to the high priest once a year, Day of Atonement, going in to make atonement. Now, there is actually another correspondence, and that's earth, right? So let's actually give it an earth tone. And so we'll pretend this is earth. And within earth, you have Eden, and again, not proportioned, but here you have Eden, which is not the entire earth. Eden is part of the earth. It has geographical boundaries. It's part of it. It's not the entire thing. And within Eden, you have the Garden of Eden, which is an even smaller portion. This looks like a inverted avocado, but this is our earthly layout. So it's important not to conflate all of these sections. Eden, or rather the Garden of Eden, is not Eden. And Eden is not the entire earth. The Garden of Eden is not the entire earth, right? These are all sections. They're gradations of holiness, if you want to think of it that way. Because God meets with Adam and Eve here. And even, in fact, when they are driven out, that's when we're actually told that there were, in fact, these boundaries, these boundary markers, where you have, the guardian, the cherub, the flaming sword, all of that which divides, which moves them out of this area. So this area is enclosed, like the Holies of Holies, like all that kind of stuff. But that would mean then that the Garden of Eden corresponds to the Holies of Holies, which corresponds to the summit of Mount Sinai. And I don't think it's a stretch to put it that way, because if we were to, let's change these colors again. Let's make the whole thing gold. This is supposed to be gold. And because in Revelation 21 or 22, the very end of Revelation, you actually have the New Jerusalem, which comes down from heaven to earth, and it's in the shape of a perfect cube. That's interesting because the only other perfect cube in the Bible is the Holy of Holies. So this corresponds to this. So the point is, I don't think that there's this giant structure necessarily that's a perfect cube. I mean, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But what it's symbolically getting at is that the entire creation becomes the most holy place. It becomes, the summit of Mount Sinai, right? Those are all pointing to the same reality, where everything becomes the Garden of Eden. Everything becomes the summit of Mount Sinai. Everything is holy now. There's no divisions anymore in the New Jerusalem. And I think that that's the symbol, but it's a symbol that starts all the way at creation, goes to Mount Sinai, goes to the temple, tabernacle, structures, all of that stuff. I don't think it's a coincidence that the two perfect cubes in the Bible, one in the Old, one in the New Testament, are the Holy of Holies and the New Jerusalem at the very end. But it's with these observations that Douglas proposed here that this paralleled the layout of the book of Leviticus. In her analysis, the entire book of Leviticus is laid out on the pattern of the tabernacle, that is to say, in tripartite division. And I've seen other commentaries similarly agree with this ultimate layout here, even without going into Douglas's work. So it's not artificial to see it divided in these sections. But here you see the chapter layouts as it goes around. And now what's going to be really important for us is going to be these chapters 8 through 10, even these chapters here, in this section right here as well, right? Because this is where the screen happens. But continuing on, each chunk of literature corresponds in relative size to the different parts of the tabernacle, with A, the largest, and that's chapters 1 through 17. The middle-sized is B, and the smallest is C. And of course, that's just chapters 25 through 27. And he goes on and points out it's not simply the relative sizes, but even the content as well that corresponds a bit. So we have section A, again, 1 through 17, deals with sacrifices in chapters 1 through 7, which were performed in the outer court. The laws of purity, chapters 12 through 15, which governed who could enter the tabernacle. and the laws concerning the slaughtering of animals and the prohibition against eating blood in chapter 17, relevant to the primary activity at the altar and other related issues. Section B includes laws specific to the priests, chapters 21 and 22, who alone could enter the holy place, and details concerning the lampstand and table, which were located there. I want to return to this point. Section C focuses on the blessings and curses that will arise if Israel either observed or disobeys the covenant in chapter 26, which is embodied by the ark housed in the innermost sanctum. In light of these observations, Douglas proposed that the individual chapters of Leviticus be placed on the tabernacle floor plan, providing the reader with a virtual tour of the locus of Israelite worship as one proceeds through the book. But I did want to point out, because I once saw somebody try to take this observation of Douglas, and it was in a, like a pro LGBTQ kind of argument, because they were arguing because this section 18 through 20, or specifically 18 and 20, are in, again, this part, that this was like just priestly stuff or whatever. That's a bit silly, because to argue that this somehow doesn't correspond or doesn't apply is, again, it's silly, especially because chapter 19 is often referred to as the mini Torah, because it's basically the Torah in a nutshell. And so to say that that didn't apply to the everyday Israelite is silly, especially also because chapter 17, the end of chapter 17, you're dealing with the sojourner laws. And so they were expected to keep this section as well, even the sojourners, that is, even the non-Israelites living in the land. So to try to make this just about the priest is kind of silly. And even here, Rendsburg isn't making that point. He's saying that it includes laws specific to the priest, but it's not just specific only to the priest. I just thought I'd point that out, because I have seen somebody try to make a terrible argument based off of this observation. But he's basically asking, is this eisegesis or is this exegesis? And the bulk of where he's going to go with this is these two sections, these narrative sections in Leviticus, because they're very odd and they seemingly come out of nowhere. So what we're dealing with in chapters 8 through 10 is it's Aaron and his sons in chapters 8 and 9, and then the strange fire, Nadab and Abihu, while Leviticus 24, 10 through 23 is the rather extraordinary tell about the blasphemer. Now let's go back up to the structure, because you see, again, chapters 8 through 10 would be right here, and then Leviticus 24, the very end section here, you have this narrative section, which is right before we get to chapter 25. So far, so good. It would seem to correspond. And according to Douglas, these two narratives are intended to represent the two screens or curtains that divide the tabernacle into its three constituent parts. The larger of these two is situated before the screen that separates the outer court and the holy place, while the smaller of these units is positioned before the screen that separates the holy place from the Holy of Holies. And this is the parquet. Inclusion and placement of the latter story has long puzzled readers of Leviticus. To my mind, Douglas was the first to provide an explanation for the inclusion and placement of Leviticus 20, 10 through 23. But her theory of Leviticus' structure accounts for much more than that. And so the first screen here, Leviticus 8 through 10, Douglas refers to as the first screen, includes 4 references to the area separating the outer court and the holy place. So the first 2 sections. Aaron and his sons remained at the entrance of the tent of meeting, that is, in the area between the first screen and the altar, for 7 days. Chapter 8, 31 through 36, you have an explicit reference here to the entrance of the tent of meeting. And then in the second story, which is really odd, Moses and Aaron enter the tent of meeting and then exit to bless the people. And here you have the text. Again, Moses and Aaron came into the tent of meeting and they exited. This is a very strange verse. As Milgram notes, for what purpose did Moses and Aaron enter the tent? None is cited, and it can only be conjectured. I suggest that in keeping with Douglas's model, it was to highlight the screen which they traverse in both directions in rapid succession. In other words, the reason why it has this detail that is rather pointless is to alert the reader, again, that's where you're at in this virtual tour, basically. Then you also have the strange fire, or rather, strange fire is actually 4. 3 here is the fire that comes forth before Yahweh and consumed the offering on the altar of ordination for the first time. So this is the first time This is done, and you have this is 924. This fire must have emerged from the screen of the holy place. Now you have the second fire. This is the so-called, the strange fire thing from before Yahweh in 10:2. This time, the destructive one that consumed Nadab and Abihu, which once more clearly must have emerged from the holy place. That is again passing through the first screen. So again, implicitly, you have movement through these veils, or through that first veil. Such a concentration of passages focusing on this particular locus within the greater tabernacle structure accords with Douglas's view that the reader of this narrative is in essence walking the perimeter of the outer court and halts for a moment in front of the first screen, which separates the outer court from the holy place. And now into the holy place, and basically the screen that is going to separate between the holy place and the most holy place, the Holy of Holies. So he says the second case here, this other narrative breakthrough, contains no references to the screen that separates the holy place from the Holy of Holies. But the passage that immediately precedes this episode refers to that screen explicitly. So while, again, the narrative itself, verses 10 through 23, doesn't have a reference, verse 3 does. It says, outside the curtain of the pact and the tent of meeting, Aaron shall set up to burn from evening to morning before Yahweh regularly. It is a law for eternity throughout your generations. The word paraket is specifically used, in fact, in a unique expression, the curtain of the pact. The scene, as Douglas emphasized, places us within the holy place itself. So in that second section, as God commands Moses concerning the lampstand and the table and its loaves. And now Leviticus' summit, Sinai, the Holy of Holies, and I would add the Garden of Eden. We can now return to the discussion in the opening section of this essay. Why does the first verse of chapter 25 include the expression on Mount Sinai? Moreover, this section of Leviticus closes with this expression twice, once at the end of the curses and again at the end of the entire book. So in verse 46 of chapter 26, it says, these are the laws and rules and the instructions that Yahweh gave between himself and the children of Israel on Mount Sinai by the hand of Moses. And then in 24:34, these are the commandments of Yahweh, or that Yahweh commanded Moses for the children of Israel on Mount Sinai. This enveloping of the final section of the book, chapters 25 and 26 and 27, as being from Mount Sinai is unique in the book of Leviticus. Following Douglas's model, I suggest that this enveloping structure is the coup de grace of the author of Leviticus. At this point in our text, the reader enters the Holy of Holies, corresponding to the summit of Mount Sinai, the Garden of Eden, and thus the text brings Moses to that point, or returns him to that point, as it were, by stating explicitly that Yahweh spoke to him on Mount Sinai. Moreover, this passage functions as the subtlest of references to the second screen. When we understand that Mount Sinai, i.e. the summit of the mountain where Moses converses directly with God, represents the Holy of Holies, and vice versa, in Leviticus, for Moses to have reached Mount Sinai, i.e. the Holy of Holies, he must have passed through the second screen. The author of our text has managed to surround the short narrative within two reminders of where we are at this point in our journey through the tabernacle. One as explicit as can be, the word paraket, the other as elusive as can be, the phrase on Mount Sinai. And then he ends on a personal note of, the last time he spoke to her and the series of lectures they gave. But that is more or less the argument. She actually extends the argument a little bit further as well. And she admits very speculatively in how more or less the sacrifices themselves have something of a tripartite division, although they don't correspond directly in the sense that it's not as if the laity only get one portion, the priests only get one portion, and only God gets the other portion, that kind of thing. It's not as neat, but it is essentially tripartite. And she also theorizes that perhaps the reason why the suet, the fat, was not allowed to be consumed, that is eaten, it was given over to God basically, was because the fat was the divider, essentially. It was like the curtain. It was like the clouds, the thick clouds on Mount Sinai. So you didn't eat the curtain, right? And she basically argued, too, that for the people that rejected her thesis, she was pointing out that she was basically the only one that was offering explanation for some of these oddities. Because the truth is, nobody really knows. And most people just kind of throw up their hands and say, well, we don't really know why we have those narrative break-ins. We don't know why it says that on Mount Sinai. We don't know why the fat wasn't allowed to be eaten and things like that. But this could answer those things. But I don't know. But anyway, I thought it was interesting, again, in light of what Peter Leithart had talked about with the structure of 1 Chronicles 23 through 27, because it does kind of follow that mirroring. It's chiastic, but it has that structure where one is dealing with the other, and it's kind of going through the court a little bit, the outer court, inner court. It doesn't quite do the most holy place kind of idea, but it does put at the center music in worship. But anyway, that is this issue. Hopefully you found it interesting, and hopefully some of that was new to you, but I will see you guys next time with something different.